Hello, everyone. I wish I could see all of you. I am Teresa Ghilarducci, and we are here to celebrate the New School for Social Research's Economics Department's Center for Economic Policy Analysis 25th anniversary. Our tagline is bringing reality into conventional economics. So here are the economists that do that. It is the anniversary of 25 fascinating years, but instead of looking at the past, we're here to celebrate by looking ahead. I really want to thank our panelists for being here. They're all really busy. They're here to share the success of our work, hope for the future, and we may note some past mistakes. For not more than 7 minutes, and I will enforce that. I want to apologize in advance. It helps with the panel. It helps with our technical person. Hello, Michael, behind the scenes. Thank you from IT, by the way. We have Deirdre McCloskey, who is a distinguished professor emerita of economics and of history, and a professor emerita of English and of communication at the University of Illinois Chicago. Her most recent book is titled Why Liberalism Works, and it was published by Yale University Press. Our own professor of economics at the New School for Social Research, my friend Anwar Shaikh, his most recent book is titled Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis. The professor of economics at Stony Brook University, a SCEPA senior fellow, a good friend of us all, is Stephanie Kelton. Her most recent book, The Deficit Myth, is a fantastic book, and many other people think so too because it's a New York Times bestseller. Gustavo Serra is our PhD student at the Department of Economics. He'll tell you more about himself. He's also here. Mark Setterfield is the chair of the economics department, and he will help me today moderate the panel after their remarks. So after our panelists give remarks, and as you hear them talk to each other and questions from the audience, I would like you all to answer a poll question that we've been talking about for years. And now I want to ask you. The poll question is, should we abandon the name Heterodox economics? And it's a poll question. You get yes or no. There is a polling button at the bottom of your Zoom window where you can answer. Please answer after you've heard the discussion and thought about it. And you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Mark.
Thanks, Teresa. I'll just say a very quick word of hello and welcome to everybody. Also a special word of thanks, of course, to our 4 panelists for helping making this event happen. And Deirdre and Stephanie, great to see you back at the New School. Welcome back to both of you.
Thank you.
Anwar, please.
You want me to start?
You can start, yes.
Okay. Well, let me say I'm honored to be on this panel with such eminent colleagues. And I want to thank SCEPA and Teresa for organizing this and for the huge audience they've gathered for it. Let me start with the question about heterodox economics. I was once at a reception with Joan Robinson, and she was asked to come up, and they introduced her as one of the world's most eminent woman economists. And she got offended and said, I'm not a woman economist, I'm an economist. And I feel the same way. I would like to be called just an economist, actually a real economist, as opposed to those who work on the fictitious ideal. But I have to say that heterodox economics is necessary because we're not allowed in orthodox departments anywhere in the world. And therefore we have to have some kind of name to encompass the wide variety of things. What I do is I study real patterns and I try to theorize them. My book is 1,011 pages, and 50% of it is empirical because I'm not interested in theory unless it can understand and explain patterns that exist. And by the way, Harvard Business Review is a very good source of such analysis because they're quite hard-nosed about what businesses really do. And of course, data itself, as we know, is constructed. It's not lying on the beach as pebbles, as Althusser once said, but it has to be understood, deconstructed, and reconstructed if necessary. My work is motivated by the fact that so-called practical economists often rely on some part of orthodox, by which I mean neoclassical economics. And I believe that if we're going to address the world as we see it, then we should not have to dip back into a framework which is constructed in such a strange and highly improbable way. And this point of view, by the way, is shared even in the Financial Times, so it's not as if it's a point of view in academia. So then a question arises. There's pluralism in economics, by which I mean a pluralism of framework. Of course, neoclassical economics dominates it absolutely, but as our department tries to exemplify, we also have classical political economies, Smith and Ricardo, we have Marx, Hayek, post-Keynesian economics. And then there's a pluralism of topics: race, class, gender, nationality, and ethnicity, inequality on national and international scale, and many, many others. And these are all phenomena of the world that we have to construct and try to explain. But here, it seems to me that a crucial difference arises between pluralism and eclecticism. Eclecticism, I mean, that mixing and matching theoretical frameworks, which are often antithetical to each other, in order to get an answer which seems plausible. I don't know of any other discipline, well, let's say in the sciences, because otherwise in anthropology or other disciplines, mixing and matching is perfectly appropriate. I would argue it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea because even though you draw on some aspect of a discipline to validate your own reading, other aspects will contradict other parts of the reading. And so it basically leaves you, so to speak, without a home. And I won't have time to elaborate on this, but for instance, in neoclassical theory, a rise in wages will lower demand for labor and lead to unemployment. In post-Keynesian theory, and speaking here of normal circumstances, not COVID circumstances, by the way, a rise in real wages will raise consumer demand and raise output employment. And in what I would call classical political economy, as I classify myself, there's an interesting difference because an exogenous rise in real wages will lower the profit rate. It'll slow down the demand for labor and undermine the strength of labor, which is a very important source of higher wages, and expand the pool of normally unemployed people. There's an important aspect to this, that unemployment is normal in the sense that capitalism creates and maintains it. Now, these are empirically addressable issues. They're not just theoretical. And much of my work has been involved in addressing just these kinds of issues. They also have strong policy implications. And I won't elaborate on that, but if you look at the history of, want to explain why Hitler's Germany and Roosevelt's post-depression and then pre-war activities did not lead to inflation and higher wages and so on. And yet after that, they did lead to, in the 70s, to inflation and stagflation. You have to understand how these mechanisms actually work. So I believe that one approach, which is unfortunately dominant, is to mix and match theories as you see fit to give you an answer. And then for another empirical phenomena, you mix and match something else. On the other hand, one can also take orthodox economics and add imperfections, frictions, lack of knowledge. This is a standard now among orthodox economists themselves. Or, and this is the task I set myself a long time ago, one can try to explain these by developing a coherent alternative framework. What I like about neoclassical economics, it is coherent, at least in theory. It's somewhat incoherent in the empirical and real world, but it's coherent in theory. And this for me meant going back to Marx, Keynes, Sraffa, Harrod, and excavating from their work a systematic framework. And in my book, I want to make sure I don't run over time. My clock just went. How much time do I have, Teresa? Oh, I have a minute, according to me. I try to explain empirically and theoretically, the laws of demand and supply, microeconomics, consumer behavior, wages and profit rates, technological change, relative prices, interest rate, bond, and equity prices, a la Schiller, and not Schiller, a la Soros, exchange rates, trade balance, growth, unemployment, inflation and long booms, culminating in recurrent crises. Microeconomics is derived from real consumer behavior and real business behavior under the ruthless influence of competition as a war. Macroeconomics from the aggregate effective demand, interactive aggregate effective demand and profitability, which was Keynes's key point. And I tried to do this without any reference to hyper-rationality, optimization, perfect competition, perfect information, representative agents, and so-called rational expectations, nor imperfect competition and so on, monopoly power. My book just came out in Chinese 3-4 days ago. I would hold up a copy, but I don't have one yet. It's been translated to Turkish, and the Spanish one is almost done. So if you're interested in this kind of bizarre approach, take a look at the book. You can actually buy it. You don't have to get a Russian website, but hey, whatever you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwar. I hope people buy your book. That's what we can do for each other. Deirdre, may I turn to you, please?
The audience will have to forgive my speech defect. I stutter on the words stutter, so I can't say it straightforwardly as Joe Biden does. That I agree with Anwar enthusiastically that economics, especially here in the United States, and thankfully not so much elsewhere, is highly and intolerantly and indeed foolishly orthodox. There's one way of doing economics. A famous example in my lifetime is the destruction of the Heterodox economics department at the University of Notre Dame. And that's bad. It's bad for the science. It's bad for the ethics of the science. It's bad for policy. However, I think that heterodoxy ought to include, but does not ordinarily, Austrian economics. Ted Burjak at Denison University is a rare exception to the failure to have Marx confront Hayek, for example. And now I think it should also include what is called humanomics. Bart Wilson and Verdon Smith and I are exponents of humanomics. And it says, or it urges us in a heterodox way to go on with what we can learn from the other kinds of economics, the mathematics and the statistics and the observations, the aggregate and individual observations, but add the humanities. This sounds hard to do, but it's easier than you might think. My view is that there's a certain amount of clanking machinery in the way economics is conventionally done that I would like to contextualize with human experience more broadly, with Jane Austen and Shakespeare with Kant and Aristotle, with the historians, with the cultural anthropologists. Now, as Anwar said, the proof is in the pudding. Are there insights, or I should say more exactly, scientific findings that can be attributed to this new humanomics? It's very new. We have a long way to go, but yes, I think there are. Now, for instance, I would argue and have, on the basis of wide evidence, that is quantitative, but also qualitative, that the 3,000% increase in the real incomes of ordinary folk, among them the even very poor people in places like Japan and Finland since, say, 1800, can be shown to not come from changes in law and investment, as the right side of politics claims, or from slavery and exploitation, as the left side would like to claim, but from an opening for human creativity that came with the coming in the 18th century, rather suddenly, in Northwestern Europe, to the idea of liberal equality, of liberal permissions. I'm thinking more of the Scottish side of the Enlightenment than the French. I would argue that you can show empirically, allowing yourselves all the evidence, not just the quantitative evidence or the orthodox sorts of evidence, but all the evidence that this is true. I could go on and have, you're invited to go to my website for all its marvelous findings. Like Anwar, I wish you would buy my books. You don't need to read my books, but you do need to buy the books, to speak in a capitalist way. So that's my plug, humanomics.
Oh, Deirdre, thanks very much. I'll now turn to Stephanie.
Well, thank you. And again, I share the enthusiasm of the two previous speakers. It's very nice to be with them again. I know we've done things in the past together, and thank you to Teresa for including me in this important conversation. So, I thought I would just talk a little bit about, I guess, what heterodoxy has meant to me. I started off not intending to study economics at all. I was sort of on a path to studying finance. I liked the idea of thinking about financial markets. I liked the idea. I thought I liked the idea of being able to help people. And so I imagined that one day I would probably be a financial planner, help people figure out their retirement and that sort of thing. And I ended up stumbling into an economics course because it was required. It was a micro theory course, intermediate level. And it was taught by John Henry. And I know that that's a name that is familiar to Deirdre and to Anwar. And I think I have memories of both of you being at one of my previous universities at UMKC when John was there. And, John taught a straight neoclassical econ course. There was absolutely nothing inspiring whatsoever about that course in terms of the content. But John was inspiring, and he was masterful in the classroom. And on the very last day of that class, he used the opportunity to finally allow us to think critically about what we had been presented with over the course of 15 weeks. Because if we pushed back at all during the course, he would say, no, don't do that. Because we'd say, well, in the real world, I said, no, don't do that. He wouldn't let us ask questions or challenge the underlying assumptions, the models. We could not do that. And on the last day, I remember this very clearly. He said, look, if you've got a good theoretical model, if the model works, you should be able to begin to relax the assumptions, and the things should more or less still hold together. So John started relaxing assumptions, and here we were, finally allowed to really kick the tires on this thing. And the whole class just ended up trying to defend it and to push back against him. And I didn't realize until some years later that what John did in that final lecture was to introduce us to the capital controversies without ever calling it that. And so I got, more interested once I realized that, I wasn't just doing economics as an indoctrination program, that I had to take these models and accept everything that had been presented, no questions asked. And I took the history of economic thought with him. And that's where things really opened up for me. And that's when I kind of started to fall in love with the idea of studying economics. John took me to someone at some point. He said, listen, you ought to go to graduate school. And so I did. And I didn't know where I wanted to go. So John had me talk with another economist. I won't name him. And he said, go to Harvard. And he said, if you go to Harvard, you won't suffer the slings and arrows that you would suffer if you went through a sort of heterodox economics program. And I thought, yeah, but I have to do a mainstream, program. And how am I going to write a dissertation? He said, no, you write it and you throw it away. And I just knew that I didn't have it in me to go through a program like that, make that kind of commitment, get up every day, write a dissertation that I probably, didn't believe was really very worthwhile, and then just walk away from it all. So I applied to a number of other schools, and it came down to two for me. I think that the new school probably financially is why it wasn't in the final two, but it was either Notre Dame, which Deirdre mentioned earlier, because I would have studied with Marty Wolfson, or Cambridge. And I had this idea that I could go to Cambridge University, I could expose myself to the rich traditions. And, I understood that, Keynes and Joan Robinson and Nikki Calder and Sraffa weren't walking the halls, but I figured there was enough left of that tradition there that I could benefit from that and still come out with a degree from Cambridge, and maybe that would somehow serve me well. But the reality was that the program was a one-year taught program, is how they referred to it. 4 courses at the graduate level, and you write a dissertation and you're done. And that made me nervous because I wasn't sure I could consider myself a real economist with just 4 graduate courses under my belt. So anyway, I got a fellowship, and it took me to the Levy Economics Institute. And Levy is just upstate from Manhattan, and that allowed me to jump on a train once a week and travel down to the city and sit in on Ed Nell's class at the New School. And, I've probably told this in forums like this with you guys because, it's one of my best memories, and it changed the trajectory of my life and my own career. I sat at the New School and I listened to students, in a sort of coffee shop, cafeteria, I forget what you called it back then. And I could just hear the conversations taking place at the tables around me. And I'd never heard anything like it. It didn't happen at Cambridge. It was otherworldly. People were thinking deeply about the world around them. They were having philosophical conversations. They were having class conscious conversations, I loved it, and it energized me. And for me, it was what economics was supposed to do. It was supposed to get your juices going and get you really thinking and challenging things. And so I decided that, you know, there was so much more that I needed to know. And so I ended up joining the new school and finishing my PhD there. I think, Anwar, you were on sabbatical, and I really was only there for 1 year, and you were on sabbatical that year. So I didn't get an opportunity to take your course, which I was always, you know, I always regretted not overlapping with you then. But I finished, I didn't suffer the slings and arrows. I came out of a heterodox program. I took a position at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And when I joined with Matt Forstatter, who's another New School alum, and Randy Ray. And a couple of years later, we got Fred Lee to come on board, and we had this incredible department, very intellectually diverse. John Henry joined us later. We had institutionalists like Jim Sturgeon. We had old labor IRP people like Gene Wagner. We had Marxists. We had post-Keynesians. We were an eclectic, and we had neoclassical economists. So it was an incredible place to be, because somehow, some way, we all managed to get along swimmingly. There was no infighting. I can't recall a single time when there was real discord among the faculty. And I think the students, we had a very large PhD program. At one point, I think we had 83 students in the master's program and 60 in the PhD program, and we had about 12 faculty members. So we were small, but we built an interdisciplinary PhD program, which meant that you did, you know, economics and you did a secondary discipline, and it really meant something. And so students could pair their econ with philosophy or psychology or political science or sociology, anthropology, math, whatever it was. And, you know, I guess I felt like, because economists are given this preferred status, right? That you don't often hear, you're not going to hear President Biden often maybe stand up on stage and say, leading sociologists say, but it's economists, what economists are telling us, what economists say. And we have this outsized voice in the debates, especially, you know, with respect to policy. And I guess I always just felt a sense of responsibility in the way that I approached the, you know, hiring decisions and in the classroom and teaching, that it was important to recognize that we were training the next generation of people, economists who were going to have one day possibly an outsized influence in these debates. And so, you know, I always wanted to try to create better frameworks, more relevant frameworks, better ways to analyze the workings of a capitalist economy. And at the end of the day, to remember why it is that we do this work. And it's got to be about more than elegance and the beauty of our models, but, you know, the ways in which they impact and matter to real people. So I'm going to stop there.
That's just wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. What a great, what a great bright spot. And with that, Gustavo, it turns out people come to the new school for not the faculty, but for the students. So please go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel to share my background and pose a question for discussion. So I'm a third-year PhD student in economics at the New School, entering the academic job market this fall. My master's degree is from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, which is a mainstream program with a small heterodox section. And like most economic curriculums, the core courses heavily rely on mathematical frameworks, such as the general equilibrium theory, which assumes independent profit-seeking agents who make optimal decisions across time. Theories that are presented as true economics, and reality is fitted to the textbook framework and not the other way around. Conflicts over distribution and financial crisis, for example, are not usually addressed for mathematical tractability. And research that does not use this math rigor is considered soft science or not economics. In my professional work, the mismatch between textbooks and reality was striking. So first in class, the economy was explained with only 3 equations. Influential economists debated economic growth models where the only relevant variable was the saving rate. Fiscal policy had no impact on economic activity, the labor market was always in full employment, and monetary policy assumed money neutrality and the impossibility of financial crisis. I came to the new school mostly influenced by my professors from the University of São Paulo, such as Laura Carvalho, a new school alumna. And I came here not expecting a single true economic approach. Instead, I was looking for an academic environment such as the one that we have here today to discuss the relevance and shortcomings of different schools of thought. And of course, I expect to bring those values to academia and policy debates back in Brazil, although I understand the difficulties of being a heterodox economist in environments dominated by mainstream ideologies. So with this in mind, I have 2 questions here for the panel. First, universities require professors to publish in top economic journals, but they reject pluralism. So how does a heterodox economist follow a relevant research agenda and thrive in the face of the existing pro-mainstream incentives? And my second question here is, to what extent should a heterodox economist keep up with the mainstream literature when most mainstream economists do not follow the heterodox literature? Should heterodox economists always develop the research in contrast to this mainstream literature, or can they follow their own path? So again, thank you all for the great debate today and your contributions.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. I will ask the panelists to keep Gustavo's questions in their mind, but right now, some of the most valuable aspect of these panels is when the panelists get to speak to each other. We would be doing this much more naturally if we were all together. And I want you to know that you're talking to over 300 people now. They range from reporters from Japan to a high school student. So you have imagine your audience. And I'd like you to talk to each other in a particular way. I would like you to, and I'll ask you to go in the order that you spoke. What is it that you like about each other's work or what each other just said today? And where do you respectfully disagree? And if you can respond to Gustavo's questions now or in the Q&A, that would be great too. We have some time. You were all very terrific and respectful to each other on the time. So let's start. And Mark, when you need to jump in, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. I picked up on a couple of themes, including themes from the questions, but let's hear from the panelists first.
Oh, okay, I'm just going to point to Anwar since you spoke first. You have to unmute everybody, including you, Anwar.
Okay. Well, it's such a pleasure to be on a panel with such interesting and literate people. As you know, our profession does not always generate that cohort. I agree with Deirdre on so many, almost everything actually that she said, but let me just mention one thing. It's absolutely important that Austrian economics and Hayek have been excluded. I recently rediscovered that connection. And what I found, I gave a lecture at the New School in the economics department on Marx and Hayek. And my emphasis was not on their opposition, but on their similarity. It's astonishing how similarly they see capitalism and how it works. And certainly Marx talks about the great wealth that capitalism has brought to society. He's emphatic on that. So their difference was really about whether it's possible to go beyond capitalism. And that's a relatively important difference, obviously, but anyway. And I agree totally with the idea that economics should have humanity, literature, human experience. Once when I was at Cambridge, Mass, I found a book that said that game theory could explain Shakespeare. And alas, I didn't buy the book. I should have, because I thought the concept was appalling, but I should have read it. I did read part of it, but I didn't buy it. On the issue of capitalism's strong positive impact on humanity, that's of course true. But I come from a former colonial country. I was born in India and I grew up in Pakistan. And we must not forget the bitter struggles against colonialism that capitalism was part of in creating, but also the bitter struggles of labor against the conditions of capitalist effort. I mean, China is an example of that now, Bangladesh and Vietnam, but it's an old history. And of course, it's a history that has the strongest origins in Manchester in the UK. On Stephanie's point, I wanted to just, as you mentioned, the point about John Henry really resonated with me. My micro teacher was Gary Becker, and he was a hell of a good teacher, also really difficult and didn't allow you to question things along the way. So one day we're sitting there, and by the way, the important thing is he applied his arguments to real world phenomena. His theory of marriage and of discrimination are really dominate the profession, even on the left. But one day we were sitting there and Becker came in and he abandoned everything he'd been saying and showed us how to derive stochastically the laws of demand and supply. It was a very simple principle. I didn't see it as stochastic till later, but it was a very simple principle and I never forgot it. I went and sat down on the steps of Low Library. I wrote out the argument. I added one little thing, that there has to be a minimum income for people. I was just coming from my development class. And I found that I could explain all of the empirical phenomena of microeconomics about demand and supply, elasticities and all that from the extension of this framework. It's a chapter in my book. And without Becker, I would not have found it. Just one more point, which is that, and the point there is that we have to treat people we don't agree with as some people we can learn from. In fact, indeed have to learn from, because they don't agree with us. And how else are we going to confront that if we don't? On Gustavo's question, first of all, I want to take it in reverse order. Heterodox should follow neoclassical economics. Well, here's how I do it. I'm interested in a particular topic, let's say inequality, which happens to be current interest of mine, race, gender. Then I look at what the empirical evidence is first, because I can't judge the models by just the models. I want to judge what they're trying to explain. I'm not intimidated by the math. I have an engineering background. So the question is, what's the substance of the argument? And that's a lesson I learned from Becker. But in the end, I have this bizarre commitment to trying to fit it together in a coherent framework. So I have to go back. So if I may, I know I'm running on, but let's give you an example of this. I've long been interested in race, class, and gender. We had a whole program at the New School for 10 or 15 years, very prominent women economists who've gone on to make big names for themselves. And I thought, I ran across a discipline called econophysics, and it was really about startling patterns in economics, patterns that really couldn't be explained. So I thought, okay, I will do this for race and gender, and I'm sure the patterns will be different. The pattern is the income of workers follows a law called an exponential law, or in physics of thermal distribution. And the data shows that everywhere. Go to the IRS, you can find the data again and again. But I thought, okay, cannot be true by gender or race. So I had the data and I did it. And I found, of course, women's incomes were lower, blacks' incomes were lower than whites, but astonishingly, distribution of income within each group was essentially the same. And that led me to think, well, how could that be? We intervene in so many different ways. And I realized that what I was looking at is outcomes generated by the market. Then the question is, how do you explain it? How do you explain it coherently from within a framework? And I discovered that going back to Adam Smith's idea that labor migrates from low wage to high wage areas, turns out if you put it in a framework, which is a familiar one in physics, you can generate these patterns. And the framework is very simple. People collide.
Anwar, can I stop you?
I'm stopping. Let me stop.
Yeah, okay.
So
All right.
the point was that you have to look at what others have done, but you don't have to simply start there or aim
Okay. Okay. Deirdre, what do you like about each other's work?
Well,
Disagree?
I like very much Stephanie's inspiration to help people and to follow her own star. And in reply to Gustavo on that, I would say that you should focus, as Anwar does, and as I do, on problems, on peculiarities, of oddnesses, of things that on their face seem strange, and then explain them. And explain them with supply and demand curves, if that seems to work, or with the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles, if that seems to work, and solve the problem, and then write a book.
Yeah.
Don't bother with the top journals. That I heard for a while on the editorial committee of the American Economic Review when Joe Stiglitz was the editor. And I could only stand it for a couple of years because practically every paper I encountered was, in my view, and this is the view of the American Statistical Association, misusing tests of statistical significance. And virtually all of them were appallingly written. and I got tired of saying this paper isn't any good, don't publish it. And of course, they were all highly orthodox. So our way forward is so to speak, as Stephanie has done, right beyond the orthodoxy, right to an audience slightly beyond it. But what I'm not so sure about in my esteemed colleagues here is a convention that you find in standard issue, what I would prefer to call Samuelsonian economics, not so much neoclassical, because that also includes Austrians, but okay, Samuelsonian economics, and in Marxist economics and institutional economics and so forth. This idea that there are terrible imperfections in the way capitalism operates, that it fails to satisfy the supposed assumptions on which it's justified. And the problem is that practically no one has shown this to be true empirically. One courageous attempt in 1966 was by a couple of Marxists, Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy. They failed, but they tried. So I would urge people to look into how close these arguments, these models that we talk about, whether heterodox or orthodox, how close they are quantitatively speaking, to the
Thank you.
actual economy.
Thank you. Stephanie.
Well, I mean, I think that, the advice that Deirdre just gave, and I'm speaking to Gustavo really, about, finding something that you really care about.
Sure.
Find your passion and write about that. It's very hard. I couldn't write for the purpose of, ticking the boxes and jumping through the hoops for the tenure process. And I know that it's part of the game, right? As an academic, there is an expectation that you're going to have a certain number of publications in order to get promotion and tenure. And here, I just think it's so important that when the decision is made, about which programs to apply to, which department do you want to be in? What do you want to find as your academic home? Who do you want for your colleagues? That's such an important part of the consideration that, if you are aiming for the so-called top, then you have an understanding of what those expectations are. I can remember many years ago being in a pub with a group of economists, journalists, and others. There was a blogging conference taking place. And there was an economist there. I won't give too much away so people can't figure out who it is, but he was at, a second tier, like a very highly ranked, but not a Harvard sort of thing. And he had just been told that he was being denied tenure, and he had a wife and a 5-year-old daughter, and he could not get an article in the QJE or the JEL. And they told him, you got to have one in one of these 3 journals or you're out. That kind of pressure. And he sat sobbing, in a room full of mostly other economists. And I felt so bad for him, But in my department, and it's funny because Fred Lee took on this project of the journal rankings. And he, Teresa, this, I'm sure maybe others do as well. Fred did this kind of probably year-long research where he redid the assessment and re-ranked the articles and the departments based on, his array of factors and considerations. And what do you think he found? It basically inverted the hierarchy. It inverted the hierarchy. And he all of a sudden is showing that, programs like yours at the New School and ours at UMKC were really among the highest ranked departments when you take into account, number of publications and so forth. And you're not heavily weighting this small number of publications. So, writing, I couldn't write. I couldn't wake up and sit in front of a computer and write about something that I wasn't truly passionate about. So finding a home and a group of colleagues who will respect and support your work and your research, even if it's a far departure from what they're uniquely interested in, but, support you through that process. Nothing's more important, because in all likelihood, you do have to jump through those hoops early on, and then you can do what you want after that.
Can I make a comment on that? I jumped through the hoops, not because I was compromising, but because I was stupid, and I believed in the hoops. So I jumped through them. I got tenure at the University of Chicago, but 5 years later, tiring of the atmosphere in economics at Chicago, I moved to the University of Iowa, which is not even ranked, in what Stephanie was calling that second group, and I was free. I in fact formed a group, a highly interdisciplinary group. I was the only economist in the group, English professors, professors of hydrology and so forth. And I made an intellectual life because I was able to. And it's not because I'd been at Chicago or published a lot. It was because I was at what Stephanie is describing, and I found these people.
Deirdre, I'm going to interrupt you not because I'm rude, but I want to keep up with the audience and with our time. We're going to end when we said we would. Mark, would you like to start the questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to introduce a couple of broad questions, if I could, that are partly inspired by some of the audience commentary. One is, all three of you have touched upon things like neglect of the object of analysis, lack of intellectual breadth. Are economists just bad social scientists? And if so, is the fix easy? We have history departments, we have psychology departments, maybe they can tell us something, maybe they should. And then secondly, we all get caught up in ideas because we're all economists. But when we're thinking about the future of heterodox economics or the future of economics writ large, should we be operating at the level of ideas? Or is the problem at its core, for example, the sociology of the economics profession, or the influence of private wealth or something externally on what gets funded and what research gets done?
I think it's extraordinary how orthodox American economics is and how hierarchical it is. This foolish talk about the top journals. If the deans required people in an economics department to read the work of the candidate instead of just scoring them with a hasty look at their CV, it would revolutionize economics.
Stephanie and Anwar, quickly, please. I want to get to these questions.
I think the problem, Mark, and we all know this, is that for the most part, economists don't think of themselves as part of a social science.
No, they don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They're, for example, they scorn sociology.
Right.
Anwar.
You're on mute, Anwar.
Let me remind you that we've all mentioned how important the history of economic thought was in our understanding. And the whole point is that economists were not like this before. This is a degeneration.
Yeah, you're right.
And a retreat from reality.
Yeah,
and I always attribute it to the fact that the neoclassical framework is a framework that presents a perfect and ideal vision of capitalism. And that's why people like Hayek and Marxists rejected it from the start, because this is an ideological construction. But it's very popular for the same reason that the church's version of Garden of Eden was popular if it could be enforced by a few burning at the stakes. So I think from that point of view, we should and must be connected to other social sciences, but it does not mean that we can arbitrarily mush together. At the New School, we're always being told it's time for interdisciplinary, and you go, yay, okay, all of you have to be like anthropologists. Wait a minute, they don't study our data, they don't ask our questions. Well, that's not, you have to move over, and that I reject.
Okay. I have a question that's a real swerve, but it comes up over and over in the chat. And I think one of the reasons why people tuned in, which framework, orthodox, a version of orthodoxy, your own frameworks, better addresses and understands the climate crisis? Should we use heterodox or orthodox economics? Stephanie, I'll start with you in reverse order.
Well, what am I going to say?
And why?
I would point people, I always try to stay in my lane. I have my framework, I have my lane. I try to respect what I don't know. I'm not a climate or an environmental economist, but people like Steve Keen. Steve's done incredible work lately, and I will sit in and sometimes listen to his online talks where he went after Nordhaus. So, you have the orthodox, premier kind of orthodox example and approach to the questions of the application of the orthodox framework to questions of climate change and so forth. And I think Steve just demolished it from a non-orthodox perspective. So
Yeah. I know, I don't think any of us are climate change, but it's the prevailing problem of our day. Deirdre.
Well, I would then speak up for Bill Nordhaus. I'm perfectly prepared to hear out criticisms of his argument, but I think we all agree that if you're going to criticize an argument, you should understand it. When I was a kid, I was a kind of a unscholarly Marxist. And I've read a lot of Marx, so maybe I'm in a position to argue with Marxists, but it won't do. And I don't think Stephanie is proposing it to just sort of sweep aside cost and benefit.
Anwar.
Well, let me start by saying what I said about Hayek and Marx. Both would agree that capitalism is very efficient. And certain things it's obvious, but its efficiency comes from profit making and the consequences of profit making. And you can really see where it's not profit making, like the environment. You can dump all kinds of stuff in the river. Well, that's good, that's efficient. And so we have to understand that this is not an externality, it's an internality. It's as internal as the consequences of profit making on human behavior. When I was a graduate student, I was completely repulsed by this definition and representation of human behavior. I mean, it didn't fit my family, that's for sure, any culture that I've ever heard of. So I started to study anthropology and sociology in effort, but the gap between those two still was huge, and it took a lot of work to make it up.
Oh, we have two minutes left. Mark.
Yeah, Teresa, a question that has come up that I think might be nice to put to the panel is, what, if any, idea from orthodoxy would you retain? And what, if any, idea from heterodox economics, however defined, would you be eager to discard?
Well,
I would be eager to discard the conflictual bias among the left wing. I think it drives you away from the very common cases in which cooperation is what's actually happening.
Stephanie.
I don't know. I'm still noodling. I want to pick. I wanted to pick something really smart. I don't know about discarding from heterodoxy. I hadn't. My mind hadn't gone to that yet. I was still fixated.
I can go to Anwar. Want me to pun it to Anwar and let you noodle?
Yeah, I mean, there are some level of scarcity, I guess, I would retain.
I'll come back to you. You get a chance. Anwar.
I think for me, what I retain from orthodox economics is the importance of markets and especially competition, because that's a theme that is central to the classical tradition also. And secondly, what I reject is a reduction, therefore, on the left, of capitalism to monopoly. I've never believed that. And Baran and Sweezy, as Deirdre said, great work, but in my opinion, one of its defects was that monopoly is too easy a target for you to sweep everything. You have to understand that competition bothers real capitalists. They're always worried that any minute someone's going to eat them, and they're not wrong about that. So competition, definitely.
And now Stephanie. Their minds work more quickly than mine. I guess on the orthodoxy, I keep the idea of trade-offs, the importance of centering our thinking around the importance of trade-offs. But I'm not committed yet on the heterodox question. I'm sorry, we will do this next year.
Okay, right. We're together. Thank you all very much. I would like to ask the panelists before we leave and sign off to answer the poll. We are going to post many of these remarks on the After Action website. We have a paper on heterodox economics on the website as well, and we will publish your questions on the website, and then I will sort through them and ask that they be answered again on the website, or a team will answer them. So it's not really over. We have after event living And the videos will also be posted, so tell your friends. Thank you very much from the new school, and thank you, my friends who've come back. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
See
Ciao,
you,
ciao.
Deirdre, Stephanie.
Take it easy, but take it, as we say in Chicago.
Yes.